What was 19th century intuitionism?
To some extent all philosophical systems have a place for intuition. Direct knowledge that is non-inferential or cannot be proved by prior argument and for which there is no way to resolve doubts. Mill thought that William Whewell's, 1794–1866, philosophy of science was intuitive. Although it was in places quite inferential. However, Whewell did have an explicitly intuitionist moral theory. Other noteworthy 19th-century intuitionists were William Hamilton, F. H. Bradley, Henry Sidgwick, James Martineau, and, toward the end of the century and into the next, Henry Bergson.
What was W. V.O. Quine's holistic view of knowledge?
Quine's holistic view was his positive account of knowledge after he attacked the second dogma of experience. That single statements or parts of a theory can be confirmed independently of each other. Quine thought that all of our scientific and lay theories were interconnected with the most general and abstract truths, for example, the truths of arithmetic in the center of a web. Toward the periphery of this web were more specific generalizations and factual claims that were easier to give up in the face of an experience that contradicted them. It is this aspect of Quine's thought that places him in the tradition of pragmatism.
What were Emile Durkheim's main ideas?
Durkheim thought that the horde, or non-organized group, was the simplest kind of society. And he analyzed existing tribal societies as having developed simple methods of social organization from their recent horde. Past. Social complexity was an evolutionary process, and in the societies of his day, Durkheim addressed the problems attending their complexity, such as individualism and dissolution of older forms of solidarity. Because modern societies were based on divisions of labor, the best way to solve these problems was through professional and trade organizations. Durkheim believed that religion could be understood as a reverence for those social norms and traditions that shaped human life.
What was René Descartes like as a person?
It is difficult to say. In contemporary terms, Descartes would probably be considered a fearful, anxious, and self-absorbed man with social disorders. He was the only 17th-century philosopher who never had a patron or a secure post. And he was not independently wealthy. Descartes moved to Holland to escape the distractions of Paris, so that he could concentrate on his work. He was secretive about his personal life and moved his household about once a year during a 20-year period. Wherever he was, he conducted experiments, sometimes getting animal organs from local butchers. One account has it that when he studied vision, he literally looked through a calf's eyes. Descartes was greatly interested in special foods and diets, possibly as a way to prolong life or even to achieve immortality. At times he was a vegetarian. It's clear this was not for moral reasons. Given his belief that animals are machines, and other times he thought that the secret lay in eggs. With a servant named Helena Jans, he had an illegitimate daughter. While Descartes' daughter, Francine, is usually described as illegitimate by biographers. Her baptism was recorded in 1635 in the Reformed Church in Deventer. Francine died at the age of 5 from scarlet fever, and Descartes expressed great sorrow for this loss. Descartes' motto was said to have been, "A life well hidden is a life well lived." Another version has it as, "I advance masked."
How is environmentalism related to feminism?
Feminists have addressed the exploitation of natural environments as part of overall cultural misogyny insofar as the earth is at least metaphorically female. Also, some of the exploitation of animals is centered on female animals. Chris Cuomo explores this last thesis and characterizes living beings in an interesting way as having dynamic charm in feminism and ecological communities, 2002.
Was there other philosophical activity in St. Louis besides the St. Louis Hegelians?
Contemporary with the St. Louis Philosophical Society, and also located in St. Louis, were a Kant Club, an Aristotle Club, and a Plato Club that later became known as Academe.
Where does the human mind fit into Hegel's idealism?
Human Geist, or mind, or spirit, is made up of the same categories that form reality, according to Friedrich Hegel. These categories, as ideas, develop in the individual life and in humanity as a whole over time. There are 3 stages of spirit, with the second higher than the first, and the third higher than the second. The first stage is subjective spirit, which is individual psychology. The second stage of Geist is objective spirit, or the traditions, rules, and institutions of society. The third stage of Geist is absolute spirit, evident in the arts, religion, and philosophy. As spirit understands itself, it becomes free and aware of itself, or self-conscious. Spirit preserves, destroys, and raises up what is not spirit.
Did Boyle's materialism mean he was an atheist?
No, Boyle, 1627 to 1691, was not an atheist. He was a very devout Protestant, and wrote at length about how science and religion could be reconciled. His main publications on this subject were the Christian Virtuoso, 1660, and A Disquisition about the Final Causes of Natural Things, 1688. However, in his disquisition, he argued that, in everyday work, a scientist should only consider the primary qualities of particles. He meant by this that a scientist, unlike everyone else, would not focus on colors, sounds, textures, and smells.
What are the four causes as defined by Aristotle?
Scientific knowledge provides causal explanations of real kinds of things. Aristotle asserted that there are four causes: formal, material, efficient, and final. The formal cause of your dog is what makes the animal a dog. It is its dog essence. The material cause of the dog is the physical stuff of which it is made, its matter. Aristotle believed that matter or physical reality is the same in all things but uniquely informed by their specific forms. The efficient cause of the dog is its birth and the food and water it consumes. The final cause of the dog is its ultimate purpose or function as a dog, its full development as a dog, and its ability to be a loyal friend and helper to human beings in general. And because it is your dog - yours in particular. Form is the actuality of a substance and matter is its potential. The particular puppy you first brought home had the physical potential to become the fully excellent creature it grew into.
How did Anaximenes revise the theories of Anaximander?
Anaximenes, c. 580 to 500 BCE, who followed Anaximander in the Ionian school founded by Thales, believed that the primary substance of the universe was air. Air could itself change from hot to cold and back, so with air as the primary substance it was no longer necessary to explain how the primary substance caused the separate perceptible substances. Air could either expand or contract. Expanded air became fire. Contracted air became the denser materials of wind, cloud, water, earth, and stone. In many religious traditions, including Hindu yoga, life itself is breath. The ancient Greeks strongly held this association, going back to the 8th century BCE. But Anaximenes was the first to give it formal expression.
What have been the main themes in philosophical feminism?
Philosophical feminists have thus far been very open to theoretical work from other disciplines. They have concentrated on theorizing the oppression of women in the history of philosophy, as well as contemporary culture. The result in the United States alone has been a vast body of work with many facets. Although feminism is hardly part of mainstream philosophy in academia, most philosophy departments now have women members. Examples of influential feminist scholarship include feminist reclamation, feminist epistemology, feminist political theory, and gender theory. An excellent overview of these subjects is Alison M. Jagger and Marian Young's A Companion to Feminist Philosophy, 2000.
How and why was Locke's idea of the social contract different from Hobbes'?
Locke held that the social contract was an agreement between citizens or their representatives and the government or king. Because basic amenities of human life and its fundamental social institutions were present before the social contract, government was not as essential in Locke's view, as it had been in Hobbes'. Human society existed and functioned well before government. And if government dissolved or if the governed brought it down for just reasons, society would still exist. However, if something destroyed society, that would also destroy the government.
What are some examples of the perplexities Maimonides set out in his Guide of the Perplexed?
First, and perhaps foremost, was the question posed in Guide of the Perplexed of what kind of knowledge it is possible for people to have of God. According to the doctrine of negative theology, which Maimonides took over from Avicenna. 980-1037, nothing positive can be known about God. Because God has nothing in common with any other being experienced by humans, and humans have no experience of God. All that we can know is what God is not. Negative theology is the doctrine that God cannot be known by man. Second, there is a contradiction between the idea of God on which Judaism is founded and the philosophical, Aristotelian idea of God. The philosophical idea is that God is intellect, whereas the religious idea is that it cannot be known what God is. Maimonides, 1135-1204. Sums up this problem with what he calls very disgraceful conclusions in the following passage. Namely, it would follow that the deity, whom everyone who is intelligent recognizes to be perfect in every kind of perfection, could, as far as all beings are concerned, produce nothing new in any of them. If he wished to lengthen a fly's wing or shorten a worm's foot, he would not be able to do so. But Aristotle would say that he would not wish it and that it is impossible to will something different from what is, that it would not add to his perfection, but would perhaps from a certain point of view be a deficiency. Third, Maimonides rejected the Aristotelian doctrine of the eternity of the world. Although he could offer no conclusive rational justification for this rejection, neither did he affirm that this was an issue in which religion was definitively correct.
What was Arthur Schopenhauer's influence?
Schopenhauer's philosophical ideas influenced Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900. And his idea of an unconscious will was formative for Sigmund Freud's, 1856 to 1939, ideas of psychology. Schopenhauer had profound effects in literature and was the first significant Western philosopher to incorporate Eastern thought in his system.
What were Friedrich Nietzsche's views on religion?
In Beyond Good and Evil, 1886, The Genealogy of Morals, 1887, and The Antichrist, 1888. Nietzsche described Christianity as a sickly ethics of weak people's resentment of the strong. He thought that before Christianity blonde beasts had become masters of their subjects through daring acts of ferocity. That ancient ruling class was naturally cruel to those not as strong. These fierce rulers saw their weak subjects as base, while their own traits of pride, courage, reverence for tradition, and loyalty to one another constituted their virtues. The old aristocratic system of values was in time destroyed through the machinations of a priestly class, which denied itself by turning its cruelty inward, and encouraged the oppressed masses to identify what hurt them as morally bad evil. Christianity was thus a slave morality in Nietzsche's opinion. Its uselessness for living fully evident in the worship of a slain God and a rejection of earthly vitality for hopes of joy in heaven. He thought that Christianity was a powerless religion for powerless people, a slave religion with a slave morality for slaves. But he cautioned the strong, one has to test oneself to see that one is destined for independence and command and do it at the right time. One should not dodge one's tests, though they may be the most dangerous game one can play and are tests that are taken in the end before no witness or judge but ourselves.
What was the Athenian school of Neoplatonism?
The Athenian school was founded by Plutarch of Athens, 350 to 433, and carried on by Syrianus, c. 370 to 437, whose most important student was Proclus, 412 to 485. This school was actually the same institution that had been Plato's academy. The Athenians added new levels to Iamblichus's system in the form of gods who were interested in philosophical matters and whose thought could be understood by mortals. Although they did not accept Iamblichus's notion of two ones.
What are the two types of ideas according to George Berkeley?
Ideas, according to Berkeley, can only exist in one or another mind that is capable of perceiving them. The two types of ideas known to human beings are ideas of sense, which come into the mind from somewhere outside it, and ideas of the imagination. God, however, who creates all ideas out of nothing, does not have ideas of sense because nothing can affect him. God has only ideas of imagination. No idea is capable of doing anything on its own. Every idea is passive. Only minds can act or do anything. All ideas must exist in minds. Without minds, there are no ideas.
How did Augustine support the theology of the Church with philosophy?
St. Augustine, 354 to 430, tried to justify the whole of human knowledge, even though he also allowed for error. All knowledge, according to Augustine, resided within the soul as a substance endowed with reason and fitted to rule a body. While the soul can act on the body cannot act on the soul. God is always present to the soul, whether the soul is aware of his light or turns away from it. These views of Augustine established the superiority of religion to philosophy and also embedded God in the same human faculty associated with non-religious understanding to the elevation of religious understanding. Augustine's greatest work was the City of God, in which he separated the temporal state, government on earth, from the religious realm of the afterlife. The temporal state was to have a secondary role in ensuring peace, order, safety, and physical well-being for its citizens. The heavenly city, by contrast, requires living according to God's rules. Although the temporal and heavenly cities may at times overlap, only God's city is eternal.
What was Aristotle's main contribution to Western philosophy?
Aristotle, 384 to 322 b. CE, curbed the strain of intellectual mysticism that had been inaugurated by Parmenides. C. 515 to 450 BCE, and he formalized common sense in ways that checked the speculative excesses of his teacher. Plato, c. 428 c. 348 BCE. This enabled a solid foundation for empiricism, or knowledge based on sensory observation and direct experience. Aristotle accomplished his task via encyclopedic accounts of the existing knowledge of his day, assessments of that knowledge, and developments of it into new areas, using new methods of thought. He was a rare combination of a highly well-informed and diligent scholar and an original thinker. Like his 19th-century successor George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, 1770 to 1831, Aristotle was capable of thinking the whole world. But unlike Hegel, he thought of the whole world not as an abstract and speculative theorist would, but as an ordinary person would, if he or she could do that.
What did Alfred North Whitehead think the world was composed of in reality?
According to Whitehead, the most primitive real unit is an actual occasion, which is not anything or substance that persists in time, but a process of becoming. This process of becoming is related to every other process of becoming, or as Whitehead's commentators have explained, the basic unit of reality is a Leibnizian monad that has windows on every conceivable surface. The entire world is organic and nature is a structure of evolving processes. Reality is process. Moreover, Whitehead believed that his ontology, unlike the scientific ontology of inert objects, allowed for the existence of an evolving God.
What did St. Augustine mean when he said, "Please God, make me good"?
St. Augustine, 354 to 430, considered himself profligate in his youth, much to the distress of his mother, Monica. In his Confessions, which recounts some of this early history, he is famous for having written what is often repeated as, "Please God, make me good, but not just yet." However, some scholars think that a more accurate translation of the Latin is, "Oh, Master, make me chaste and celibate but not yet." They also think that Augustine was not so much talking about his past self as he was ironically criticizing all who lack resolve about developing their virtues and devoting themselves to God. Augustine's sins were probably not as great as his oft-quoted remark has led many to believe. As a youth, before his conversion to Christianity, Augustine was fond of drink and women. He had an illegitimate son in 372, but was in a 15-year relationship with the child's mother, which would have been considered perfectly respectable at the time.
Who are some key feminist philosophers of science?
Sandra Harding, 1935, addresses questions of whether women have privileged ways of knowing. In Third World, as well as Euro-American societies, whether the exclusion of women from science can be corrected within science, and whether scientific knowledge is itself misogynistic.
Who was Charles Hartshorne?
Charles Hartshorne, 1897 to 2000. Wrote over 20 books dedicated to developing the theological side of Whitehead's philosophy. Hartshorne posited a dynamic form of evolution that included human events, time, history, and God. God is dipolar. He has an abstract pole and a concrete one. Hartshorne thought that the necessity of God's existence could be proved in his version of St. Anselm of Canterbury's ontological argument. Hartshorne believed that Anselm was mistaken in attempting to prove the existence of God from thought, but that what can be proved is the necessity of God's existence. Hartshorne's major works are Beyond Humanism, Essays in the New Philosophy of Nature, 1968. The Logic of Perfection and Other Essays in Neoclassical Metaphysics, 1962, revised, 1973, Anselm's Discovery, 1965. A Natural Theology for Our Time, 1967, revised, 1992, The Philosophy and Psychology of Sensation, 1968. Creative Synthesis and Philosophic Method, 1970, Reality as Social Process, 1971, Omnipotence and Other Theological Mistakes. 1984, And Born to Sing, An Interpretation and World Survey of Birdsong, 1992.
What is the story behind Friedrich Schelling's scandalous romantic affair with August Wilhelm von Schlegel's wife?
When he was teaching in Jena, Schelling was close friends with German poet August Wilhelm von Schlegel, who was highly esteemed by other German romantics, and with Caroline, who would later be the poet's wife. There was discussion of marriage between Schelling and the Schlegel's daughter, Augusta. But Augusta died from dysentery in 1800, after Schelling had supervised her treatment. At first, Schelling was blamed, but later biographers exonerated him because her death was probably medically inevitable at that time. Schelling and Caroline then recognized their love for each other, and August moved out, leaving Jena for Berlin. Later, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, another famous literary figure, helped secure a divorce. And Schelling and Caroline married, after they had left Jena to avoid the predictable scandal.
What did Aquinas contribute to metaphysics in the non-religious sense?
Thomas Aquinas, 1224–1274, was very interested in the question, what does it mean to be? He sought to understand reality as a whole and tried to formulate explanations of all experience in terms of ultimate causes. About metaphysics in relation to its considerations of immaterial substances. He said, although this science considers these items, it does not think of each of them as its subject is simply being in general. Taken literally, this claim about metaphysics describes it as transcendent of religion. Because religious entities have being and their being is the subject of the most general philosophical study. Metaphysically, Aquinas determined that every being is distinct and undivided. Unum, it has meaning, verum, and there is something good about it, bonum. Aquinas distinguished between what a being is and that it is. What it is its essence, and that it is its esse. We can know the essences of things without considering their existence. But it requires an act of judgment to determine esse, that something is.
What was Charles Peirce's fourth system?
Peirce's fourth system, 1885 to 1914, introduced evolution to his second system. The whole system of sine-object interpreton, with its infinite implications, is an evolving system. The system has evolved over time and continues to evolve, as does our knowledge of it, and every sign within it. Peirce worked out many details of this process in logic and in what others considered pragmatism. He ended up with an extreme form of idealism that posited the entire universe as a living, feeling organism, with habits that are mirrored in our general laws of nature, descriptions of regularities.
What do critics of the deep ecological and animal value views claim?
William F. Baxter, a law professor who passed away in 1998, argued in People or Penguins? The Case for Maximum Pollution, 1974, that the cost of a pollution-free society would be harmful to humans. He assumed that humanism requires that humans are what matter above all else. Baxter expressed a general critical view of environmentalism held by human beings who do not believe that animals have intrinsic worth or rights equal to those of humans.
What was G. E. Moore's naturalistic fallacy?
Moore, 1873 to 1958, contended that goodness cannot be analyzed in terms of any other property. In his Principia Ethica, 1903, he wrote, "It may be true that all things which are good are also something else. Just as it is true that all things which are yellow produce a certain kind of vibration in the light. And it is a fact, that ethics aims at discovering what are those other properties belonging to all things which are good. But far too many philosophers have thought that when they named those other properties they were actually defining good. Moore thought that we know what is good directly, just as we know the color yellow when we see it. Thus, we can only point to an action or a thing and say that is good. We cannot describe to a blind man exactly what yellow is. We can only show a sighted man a piece of yellow paper or a yellow scrap of cloth and say that is yellow. The same is true of what is good.
What was the gossip about Thales?
Not only did Thales rely on water or moisture to explain the universe. When Thales was not philosophizing, he was shrewd about practical affairs. In a dry year, after he predicted good weather for the next season's olive crop, he bought up all the olive presses. He was said to have made a fortune when the bumper crop came. And he was the only one who could process the olives into oil. It was reported, doubtlessly ironically, that Thales died of dehydration while watching an athletic event. Socrates, in Plato's Theaetetus, tells of the clever witty Thracian handmaid, who mocked Thales when he fell into a well when gazing up at the stars. She said that he was so eager to know what was going on in heaven that he could not see what was before his feet. Socrates goes on to say, this is a jest which is equally applicable to all philosophers. For the philosopher is wholly unacquainted with his next-door neighbor, he is ignorant, not only of what he is doing, but he hardly knows whether he is a man or an animal, he is searching into the essence of man.
Who has claimed that animals have rights?
Tom Reagan, 1938, has based a deontological doctrine of the wrongness of killing innocents, including animals, on the premise that they have intrinsic or inherent worth. It follows from this that humans have an obligation not to harm animals, or at least some of them, for recreation, food, or experimentation. Paul W. Taylor, 1923, has extended Reagan's view in claiming that every living thing, from a germ to an elephant, has a teleological center of life that is worthy of moral respect.
Why are LBGT studies and queer theory part of philosophy now?
They have become part of philosophy along with an overall interest in expanding cultural studies to include attention to issues previously neglected. This change has been part of the humanities, generally, and philosophers have focused on conceptual issues related to these fields. Queer theory emerged in the 1990s, along with LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual studies, as a positive affirmation of sexual difference that does not fit into any of its predecessor categories, including lesbianism. Good overviews on the subject may be found in Naomi Shore's Feminism Meets Queer Theory, 1997, and helpful works on transsexuality are Susan Stryker's Transgender History, 2008, and Laurie Shore's You've Changed, 2009.
Who was William Godwin?
Mary Wollstonecraft's husband, William Godwin, 1756 to 1836. Was well known as a novelist and political radical. In his Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, 1793, he advocated utilitarianism and anarchism. He believed that the institution of government has an artificially corrupting effect on individuals because it creates prejudices. He proposed that instead of large nation-states, humans should live in small communities without government so that they can get to know each other as unique individuals. Only then will it be possible for human beings to feel sympathetic regard for their neighbors. Godwin thought that, because there is no free will, there is no point in punishment. Virtue, according to Godwin, was based on sympathy. And sympathy motivates us to bring about the greatest happiness for the greatest number of human beings. Godwin had no use for other values beyond this happiness principle. He also thought that rights were unnecessary because sympathy could do the work of protecting everyone.
Who was Alfred North Whitehead?
Alfred North Whitehead, 1861–1947, was famous in analytic philosophy for his collaboration with his student Bertrand Russell. 1872–1970, on Principia Mathematica, 3 volumes, 1910, 1912, 1913. Principia took almost 10 years to complete and was highly regarded as an impressive but ultimately unsuccessful attempt to reduce mathematics to logic. Whitehead was also the American originator of process philosophy, a version of philosophy of science and metaphysics that is similar to pragmatism in its emphasis on change and the dynamic nature of experience.
What is ethical, or moral, relativism?
There are two kinds. Descriptive moral relativism is the view that different cultures have different moral beliefs. Prescriptive or normative moral relativism is the view that the whole of what's right is what people in a given society think is right. The result of this view is that moral disagreement can't be rationally debated.
Who was Alain Locke?
Alain Leroy Locke, 1885–1954, was the first African-American Rhodes Scholar. He wrote a dissertation in philosophy at Harvard University in 1918, but was told that he would not be hired to teach philosophy, except at a black institution. Locke's dissertation was the problem of classification in the theory of value. Ralph Barton Perry, 1876–1957, was his advisor. In 1921 Locke returned to Howard University, where he had previously taught English. To chair the philosophy department, he held that position until 1953. Locke has been primarily remembered for his work in the creation and support of the Harlem Renaissance, and for his writings on black art and music. However, he also developed his studies in pragmatism and applied them to issues of racism and racial identity in complex ways that were only first recovered in the late 20th century. Locke's principal pragmatic philosophical work was When Peoples Meet, a study in race and culture contacts, 1942. Locke's other philosophical writings have since been edited and reinterpreted by Leonard Harris, 1948, and others.
Who were the early Neoplatonists?
Plotinus, 205 to 270, founded Neoplatonism in the 3rd century. He wrote most of his work between 253 and 270, and all of it was edited and published by his student Porphyry, 233 to 309. Porphyry's writings on Plotinus were developed and revised in different schools throughout the educated world, including Alexandria, Athens, Syria, and Western Europe. Early Neoplatonism ended with the work of Boethius, full name, Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius, 480 c. 524, in the 6th century, who attempted to reconcile Plato and Aristotle with Christian theology.
What is existentialism?
Existentialism is a kind of philosophy that begins from the concrete reality of the human individual's existence in the world. What is shared by all humans in their day-to-day life becomes a foundation for knowledge and the nature of reality. Existentialism is focused on human experience from the first person, some me or I.
What is the distinction between deep and shallow ecology?
According to Arnnes, 1912, shallow ecology is concern of affluent Westerners for their own clean air and water, abundant resources, and beautiful scenery. Deep ecology, by contrast, is based on biospheric egalitarianism, or the inherent value to all natural beings of their own existence, shared equally by them all. Nice envisioned the world as a total field or biospherical net in which individual organisms are related to the whole of their environments. As individuals, human beings, for example, are mere knots in the net and ought to forego some of their preoccupation with their own individual existence and selfish interests.
What did John Stuart Mill think about Jeremy Bentham's pleasure principle?
Jeremy Bentham, 1748 to 1832, had introduced the idea that the only thing good in itself was pleasure. By the time Mill wrote his Ethics, this was widely known as Bentham's pleasure principle. Mill recognized the value of pleasure, but was more interested in happiness.
What are some results of experimental philosophy?
Thus far, Bertrand Russell's, 1872 to 1970, theory of descriptions has failed. At least one intuitive test. Respondents are inclined to blame people for what they do unintentionally, which, according to philosophers, they should not. Free will is also held to be compatible with determinism. which philosophers have assumed not to be the case.
What is American philosophy?
The term American philosophy most often refers to the school of pragmatism, which began in the late 19th century. Pragmatism is internationally recognized to be a distinct form of philosophy, not only created by philosophers from the United States, but also reflective of American culture. There were, of course, intellectuals in the United States before the pragmatists, and some of their work was highly original, linked to distinct cultures, 17th, 18th, and 19th century political theorists, abolitionists, suffragists, evolutionists, Native American thinkers, American Hegelians, and New England transcendentalists. Many American philosophers after the pragmatists have worked within analytic, empirical, continental, and postmodern traditions, as well as later forms of pragmatism. American philosophy, broadly understood as an intellectual aspect of culture, would include all of these fields. However, American philosophy, as systematic philosophy, traditionally understood, narrows the subject down.
What is a meme?
In The Selfish Gene, 1976, British evolutionary biologist, Professor and author Richard Dawkins coined the term as being on a par with gene. A meme, for instance, a tune, recipe, moral system, or style of dress gets passed on from one generation to the next via cultural interaction. Although memes are not usually held to be physically inherited the way that genes are, social biologists believe them to be subject to natural selection and mutation.
What is the story about Karl Popper and Ludwig Wittgenstein's poker?
Witnesses disagree, but the most neutral account is that there was a meeting of the Moral Sciences Club in room H3 at King's College, Cambridge, on October 25, 1946. Bertrand Russell, 1872–1970, presided, and Karl Popper, 1902–1994, came to give a critical paper on Ludwig Wittgenstein's 1889–1951, Language Game Theory of Truth and How to Do Philosophy. For one thing, Popper thought that there were moral rules. At some point, Wittgenstein picked up a poker from the fireplace. He either did this to make a point or out of anger, stories differ. When Wittgenstein asked Popper what the example of a moral rule was, Popper is said to have replied, not to threaten visiting lecturers with pokers. Bertrand Russell, who was by then alienated from Wittgenstein, may or may not have interceded and told them to calm down. A very entertaining book has been written about this episode and the lives and times of Popper and Wittgenstein by British Broadcasting Corporation. Journalists David Edmonds and John I. Now, Wittgenstein's Poker, 2001. Popper's notion of falsification required that one falsifying instance either lead to the rejection of the original hypothesis, or more likely, to a re-examination of initial conditions. For example, if the hypothesis is that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and a body of water does not freeze at that temperature, the rule or hypothesis that water freezes at that temperature is unlikely to be discarded. Rather, the thermometer may need to be checked, as well as the chemical composition of the liquid presumed to be water.
Who was Rousseau?
Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712–1778, was an original political philosopher who may have contributed more than any other single person to the motivations for the French Revolution. He was, in addition, a highly creative novelist capable of gathering a reading public into a community that lived vicariously through his characters, some locking themselves up for days to sentimentally enjoy his latest novel. For these reasons, Rousseau may have been the first modern celebrity philosopher.
What did Prodicus tell his audiences?
Prodicus of CEOs, c. 465–415 BCE, said that Empedocles' four elements of earth, wind, fire, and water were divine, a doctrine that the playwright Aristophanes, c. 446–386, made fun of in The Birds. He also thought that whatever was necessary to human beings was considered holy, which was not a traditional view of religion in ancient Greece. Prodicus argued that there is no absolute good, because what is good for one man is not necessarily good for another, a doctrine that supported relativism. In his discussions of language, Prodicus tried to show how no two words can have the same meaning. He also disagreed with Democritus, c. 460–371 BCE, who had said that there could be different names for the same thing.
What happened to Locke during his life and what were some of his important publications?
John Locke was born in Rington, Somerset, England. His father was an attorney and justice of the peace who fought on the parliamentary side against Charles I. At Westminster School, which Locke began attending in 1646, he learned the classics, Hebrew and Arabic. From Westminster, he went to Oxford University, where he disagreed with the scholastic philosophy that was taught. After he achieved his master's degree, he lectured in Latin and Greek. And in 1664 he was given the position of censor of moral philosophy. When his father died in 1661, Locke inherited enough money to be financially independent. He soon met such famed scientists as Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton, and renowned physician Thomas Sydenham, who inspired Locke to train as a medical doctor. Locke never practiced medicine but was considered knowledgeable in this area all his life. In 1666, Locke met Lord Ashley, Earl of Shaftesbury. Shaftesbury suffered from an infected cyst on his liver, and Locke oversaw his surgery, including the insertion of a silver tube to drain the wound. The Earl's gratitude after recovery resulted in a long-term patronage. Shaftesbury supported Locke's philosophical endeavors and his nomination to the Royal Society. In 1668, conversations with colleagues Locke met through that connection resulted in the early drafts of his An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, 1689. Locke also served Shaftesbury in practical political ways that resulted in some of his most important contributions. He drafted a constitution for British colonial Carolina, and was secretary to the Council of Trade and Plantations. Shaftesbury was tried for treason due to his leadership of the parliamentary opposition to the Stuarts. He was acquitted, but left England for Holland. Locke also left, and while he was in Holland, his position at Oxford was taken away by the king. Then James II denounced him as a traitor after the Duke of Monmouth's failed rebellion. Locke continued to write, working on an essay concerning human understanding. 1689, and his first letter concerning toleration, 1689. He also became involved with the plan to put the Protestants William and Mary on the English throne. Locke advised William, and after the glorious rebellion of 1688, he escorted Mary, Princess of Orange, on her ship back to England. In 1689 and 1690, Locke's two major works, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding and two treatises of civil government, were completed. Always suffering from poor health, Locke then retired from his active involvements in politics. Still, he went on to write some thoughts concerning education, 1693, and the reasonableness of Christianity. 1695, followed by a vindication of the reasonableness of Christianity, 1695. This last work sparked a controversy between Locke and Edward Stillingfleet, Bishop of Worcester. Locke's denial of evidence for substance was taken by Stillingfleet to be a denial of the Anglican Church's doctrine of the Trinity, as well as a barrier to life after death through the immortality of the soul.
Who was Tenskwatawa?
The prophet, Tenskwatawa, also known as Tenskwatawa, or by his original name, Lalaithika, 1775–1834, was the brother of the Shawnee leader Tecumseh. Tenskwatawa was a powerful orator who preached a return to Native American traditions as a form of resistance against destruction and oppression suffered. In a speech to Governor William Henry Harrison in 1810, he expressed what was later to become a broadly American form of self-creation. Combined with biting wit, it is true I am a Shawnee. My forefathers were warriors. Their son is a warrior. From them I take only my existence, from my tribe I take nothing. I am the maker of my own fortune, and oh, that I could make of my own fortune, and oh, that I could make that of my red people, and of my country. As great as the conceptions of my mind, when I think of the spirit that rules the universe. I would not then come to Governor Harrison to ask him to tear the treaty and to obliterate the landmark. But I would say to him, Sir, you have liberty to return to your own country.
Is French feminism flamboyant?
At times, yes, it is. For example, Baronin Andermatt Conley relates that Hélène Sixous, 1937, used to enter the complex of the University of Paris at Vincennes in a dazzling ermine coat, whose capital worth most probably surpassed the means of many in the classroom.
What was unusual about Carl Friedrich Gauss' personality?
Gauss, 1777 to 1855, was meticulous, conservative, and did not much enjoy teaching or other disruptions of his work. He did not collaborate or help younger mathematicians. Neither did he appreciate interruptions. It is said that he was once concentrating on a problem when told that his wife was dying. He responded, "Tell her to wait a moment till I'm done."
Was there only one kind of religious life for Søren Kierkegaard?
No, Kierkegaard distinguished between two. In the first, the individual relates to God, using his idea of God to deal with guilt. In the second, there is a teleological suspension of the ethical, as in the story of Abraham and Isaac. The implication of this transcendence of the ethical is that real religion is higher and more important than what is accepted as goodness in society.
Did Hume believe in miracles?
Probably not, although he did not explicitly deny them. Hume's arguments were directed toward assessing the truth of reports of miracles. Such assessment would address the credibility of witnesses and the remoteness in time and distance of their accounts. Hume thought that if someone reported a miracle, we should ask this question, which is more likely? based on everything we know about the world, that the miracle happened, or that it did not.
What was Immanuel Kant's theory of the self?
Kant distinguished between the empirical ego and the transcendental ego. The empirical ego is what we normally think of as the self and are able to experience. The transcendental ego is the necessary origin of those fundamental structures of thought and intuition that are necessary for experience. The transcendental ego is known only as an object of thought, and not as an object of direct experience.
What is philosophical about feminist philosophy?
Unlike women's studies, which is focused on the factual and historical aspects of women's lives, feminist philosophy rethinks much of social philosophy and ethics from the perspective of women and the interests of women. Some feminist philosophers have created new philosophical subject matter, whereas others have revisited traditional philosophical approaches that were created by male philosophers. For example, political philosophers have often assumed that the basic political unit is a male head of household, thereby neglecting both female workers and the kind of unpaid work performed by women in traditional families. Feminist philosophers seek revisions and expansions of such assumptions so as to include women.
How was John Duns Scotus' work different from Thomas Aquinas?
John Duns Scotus, 1266–1308, was not opposed to Aquinas, 1224–1274, but he brought St. Augustine's, 354–430, thought into philosophical and theological conversations that were largely dominated by interest in Aristotle. Duns Scotus also drew on Avicenna's, c. 980–1037, notion of unified being in his idea of God as infinite being, who had appeared to Moses as I am who am. Duns Scotus lectured at Oxford, Paris, and Cologne, where he taught that God had created each individual being with a unique nature or hekiide. Duns Scotus thought it was the will and not the intellect that is rational, because the will can will either one thing or its opposite. The will has both an intellectual appetite for happiness and self-actualization and a desire to love things based on their inherent value. These aspects of the will incline us to love God for our own good and also because He is God. Duns Scotus introduced a new idea of intellectual intuition, a kind of awareness that enables us to be certain of our own thoughts, and in the afterlife, be in the direct presence of God.
Were all 18th century thinkers in agreement with Enlightenment themes?
No. As a counter-tradition to the general rational spirit of the Enlightenment were the Romantics, such as the writers Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Johann Gottfried Herder, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, Friedrich Schiller, and William Wordsworth. There were also those, generally referred to as the pessimists of the Enlightenment, who did not subscribe to the belief in progress characteristic of the age. For example, in philosophy, Guillaume Battista Vico, Edmund Burke, and Joseph Marie de Maistre. And in letters, William Cooper, Coderlos de Laxlos, the Marquis de Sade, and Jonathan Swift.
Was Thomas more serious about his utopian vision?
Although Sir Thomas More, 1478–1535, later, St. More, was strongly influenced by Desiderius Erasmus, 1466–1536, mockery of scholasticism. His ideas in his most important work, Utopia, are quite sober and serious. The work itself became a model for modern descriptions of the ideal society. Like Erasmus, More returned to Greek philosophy and early Christianity for ideals of human life. More sought inspiration from Epicurus, 341–271 BCE, and, like his guide, extolled simple and natural pleasures among friends with the same tastes. The principal narrator of Utopia is Raphael Hythlodaeus, a well-traveled philosopher who is fond of Plato, Plutarch, and Aristotle, as well as the Roman intellectuals Seneca and Cicero. The island of Utopia is a completely egalitarian, communistic society. Reflecting More's values, Utopia favors rights for women, traditional families, and a reliance on Christian virtues to support its main purpose of achieving happiness for all in their earthly lives.
Who were the principal sophists?
Where were many more sophists in the changing Greek society of the 5th century BCE than during other periods. Based on ancient secondary sources, the main ones, whose home base was in Athens, were Gorgias of Leontini, c. 485–380 BCE, Protagoras of Abdera, c. 490–420 BCE, Hippias of Elis, c. 460–c. 400 BCE, Prodicus of Ceos, c. 465–415 BCE, and Thrasymachus, c. 459–400 BCE.